Okay, thanks everyone for joining. Hope you're all doing well. For the new folks that haven't been on one of these before, the objective here is really just to talk through scenarios, discuss players that you may be working with, learn from other people on the call, and really it's just a place for people to share ideas and get feedback from others as well. So typically how it works is we just talk about certain players. It could be pro players, it could be junior players, it could be players you're working with, and just sort of discuss what you've been observing and seeing. So if anyone wants to start, I'm not sure if you've been following what's been going on the clay courts at the pro level, but it's been pretty interesting. But if people have specific scenarios as well, there's usually a couple of people that have players they want to talk through. So let me know who would like to start off.
Hey Mark, I have a question regarding the toss. I recently started working at a new club, and I've been helping a lot of people with their serves, and I'm noticing, one of the biggest problems they have is like the toss is all over the place, and so it's not something that I was focusing on that much, and I just wanted you to maybe like give us again like I don't know, like a little summary or of the key things. I know we want a straight arm, right? We don't want a bent elbow or wrist. We want that to be around 2 o'clock, and then the release should happen somewhere between the eye level and top of the head, right? Those are kind of like the fundamentals on the toss.
Correct. Yeah, they're
How?
definitely the starting point. So that's sort
Uh-huh.
of like making sure that you at least check off those areas to
Uh-huh.
give yourself a framework to work within. A
Yeah.
few other things that happen, I think, with the toss, and I see this all the time as well, is they may still do those areas well, but if they're a right-hander, their left arm still drifts a little bit to the left after they release the toss. So they can do everything right up to ball release, which is sort of what we discussed there, what you brought up the key positions. But sometimes they can still get the ball to drift right to left, and that's usually where we see the issue. And a lot of the time, that's due to that left arm still moving after they release the ball. So if they release the ball and their left arm drifts from right to left, then the ball is going to drift as well because it's a momentum issue with the arm. So one of the cues that seems to work really well for that issue is the moment they release the ball from the hand, they actually try to kind of lock that left arm for a quarter second or 1/8 of a second, just enough that the arm has to stay still and stiff as the ball comes out of the hand. That'll stop that ball drifting from right to left. So that's a strategy that has worked really well to try to remove that right to left ball drift that we see with a lot of players. So that's a strategy that can be helpful as well. If everything else you mentioned there doesn't completely fix it, and most of the time it will, but occasionally you'll have a player that does all that right, but their arm is still moving after the ball comes out of their hand, and that causes the ball to drift from right to left.
Yeah, no, like you said, it usually fixes it. Where I'm sometimes struggling is because they have an inconsistent toss, but they adapt, like maybe they take a step, or I don't know, they do something. When I look at the contact point, sometimes I'm second guessing myself on whether or not I should address the toss. So how do you determine if, like, is it by looking at the contact point, and then like you work your way backwards from there? Or how do you determine if someone needs to like change their toss?
Yeah, so obviously if contact point's off, that's a visual that everyone sort of sees, and you have to pay attention to contact, no doubt, because if the contact's off, something else is off earlier. So you've got to figure out the cause. We know the contact isn't the cause of your problem, that's a result. So an off contact position, let's say it's too close to the baseline or it's too far left or whatever it is, that's important to know. You got to make sure that you're visually aware of that, but you're not changing anything usually at contact. You're figuring out why did they get to that poor contact position, because they weren't usually in stage 3 correctly, or their ball toss was so far off in stage 2 that they could never recover. Because we know tennis players like to hit the ball. That's what we do. We find a way to make contact with the racket and the ball. Doesn't really matter where the ball is. So we need to make sure that we know what's causing the inefficient contact point. And most of the time, it's not a contact issue. It's a body position issue that we haven't gone through the right progression of body position up to that contact point. So obviously, you want to make sure that you're aware of where the contact is in space, but normally then you have to go back and figure out what was your first issue. Is it the toss? Many times it is. If it's not the toss, then nearly always it's something to do with stage 3. The loading position isn't correct, and then they don't stay side on, and they open up too early, and that cascade of events. So I think you definitely want to make the adjustment. Like if their contact position's not good, you don't want to let that continue. Don't sort of just let it continue being bad. Figure out, is it a toss issue, and fix that first. And then if it's still happening even after the toss is not bad, then work on the stage 3 position and making sure they're getting into load right.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, that was the last question that I had, is if obviously the contact is a result and the cause is, and where you can fix it is in stage 2 and stage 3. If you notice that there's issues in both of those, which one would you address first?
Yeah,
Toss and then
definitely start with 2,
okay,
but I would do it at the same time typically, because 2 and 3 are related somewhat. As the ball's coming out of your hand, you're already starting to go into loading. So
okay,
normally try to get the toss position and the load synced comfortably so it's somewhat related.
okay,
Because if you fix the toss completely and then a week, a month later, you try to work on the load, that may impact the tossing position and where your arm is in space and things like that.
you're right.
So
You're right.
typically,
It already
if you're going to
happened
make
with
an
us.
adjustment with both of those, try to connect it a little bit.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yeah.
It's regards to like a serving practice, and some of this is coming from baseball where they do the batting practice, but they use over and underweighted bats.
Mhm.
Would there be any similar parallels that we could use for serving in terms of over and underweighted rackets?
Yeah, so we do that quite a bit. You have to be a little careful with it because of the axis of a racket, and the length of the racket is significantly more than, say, throwing a ball. So a few extra grams on the head of a racket can really put your shoulder in a compromised position when you're getting to stage 4. So the cocking position, an extra, say, 20 grams to 50 grams of head weight doesn't sound like a lot, but it can significantly cause the racket to drop lower, which puts your shoulder into more excessive external rotation. So you have to be a little more careful with tennis because of the racket and weighting the racket the way it is. So a heavier weight is potentially more problematic than a lighter weight because of that factor. If you're going lighter weight, there's been a few studies done looking at the increase in velocity of the arm and the racket through space with lighter implements. So that is something that if you're trying to improve, say, swing speed or serve speed, using a lighter racket, it could be you find the lightest racket you can on the market, and you have them do a few serves with that. That sends a nervous system response from the brain to the working muscles to say, hey, we have the ability to swing faster. So you're sort of teaching the body that they can swing a little bit faster, and then you go back to the normal weight racket and you actually swing faster. So the historical concept of swinging 2 rackets to warm up, people used to do that sometimes. That actually didn't make that warmed up your body because it was heavier, but you were swinging a lot slower with 2 rackets. Whereas if you go lighter, you actually move through the motion faster than you would with a normal racket. So that actually transfers over to swinging your normal racket a little bit quicker. So there's definitely some valid reasons and useful ways of doing it. The challenge is the racket is so different than throwing a ball. So we typically actually suggest use weighted balls for throwing rather than trying to weight up your rackets too much, because unless I'm sort of testing the person and I'm going through their strength tests and their shoulder, I understand their range of motion, I would be concerned with just randomly suggesting to, say, junior players or someone, hey, use this heavier racket or use this lighter racket without really knowing their strength levels and their range of motion issues, because you could easily cause potential injury by adjusting their weighted rackets too much. Because it is valuable. There's good reasons for potentially doing something like that, but you need to know what you're doing and you need to be tracking your metrics pretty well. So I would use a radar gun to track their serve speed if you are going to implement something like this. And just be aware of how it's impacting the different strokes. So when you go heavier, how does that impact things? Because we see sometimes a increase in serve speed with a heavier racket, but we also know that it's putting a little bit more excessive range on the shoulder in external rotation, which in the short term they're probably not going to notice anything, but we see it in baseball as well. The overweighted balls, they get an increase in velocity in the first 3 to 6 months. It's pretty clear, but very consistently there's an injury to the shoulder or the elbow 6 months to 18 months after an implementation of a weighted ball program. So if you don't do all the right, physical training things to offset the external rotation, and it makes sense why, because a weighted ball puts your shoulder back further in external rotation, so you create more range over time, and getting more range in external rotation allows you to drop the racket a little bit lower behind your back, which is going to give you more range and let the racket come through a greater range of motion. The negative to that is you're putting your shoulder in a total range of motion arc, it's called, that is a little more excessive. And if you don't do all the right strength training activities to offset that, basically the reverse strength of what you've developed, so internal rotation strength, you need to make sure you've improved, and you actually need to make sure you improve your internal rotation range of motion significantly. If you do all that, you can potentially do it right without creating greater injury. But as I just mentioned, there's a few components there that you got to take into account, and most people don't do that well enough. So I always say, don't use weighted implements and weighted balls and things for tennis unless you really are going to do it right. Do it consistently with a good progression, and do these strength training exercises that you need to do to offset the new range of motion that you're developing.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem at all. Great question. And it is going to be something that more people are going to be doing. But you're also going to see a spike in injury rates from the people that are doing it incorrectly.
Well, one more follow-up piece to that. So yeah. I've got the smaller junior rackets, the 24, the 23, the 26-inch rackets. What about the age-old thing of just throwing the rackets up and over the fence and using that as kind of a progression? It seems to be along the same lines of what you were just talking about. It's got to be done right, and it's not probably the best idea.
Listen, if they do it from a really young age, it's great because they adapt to it from a very young age. It's much easier to start any of this stuff when they're 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. It's really hard when you try to implement this stuff at 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, because they've already gone through puberty. they've adapted their skeletal system to where they're at. They've developed muscle mass in the areas to protect their joints. And now you're bringing in a pretty unique movement that they haven't been practicing or been building up for many years. So it's always better to start that type of stuff younger, because the body adapts. The body adapts and they build up the required strength and range of motion for those movements. When they do it later in their development, it requires a lot more monitoring. It requires a lot more other exercises to offset whatever you're trying to develop. So that's going to be important. So yeah, throwing the lighter rackets is definitely a good thing. The one challenge you have to realize that many people don't is the amount of load on the shoulder and the elbow is significantly more when you release the racket, from that perspective, because you're accelerating even faster through contact. Whereas when you have to hold on to the racket, there's a forced deceleration that goes in, which means that you don't go as fast through contact. So you are getting the benefit of throwing. You're actually going faster through the contact zone because you don't have to hold on to the racket and decelerate. But as a result, you're actually going faster through the contact zone. So that puts extra load on the shoulder at that moment. You have less load on the shoulder at deceleration because it can decelerate over a longer time. It doesn't have to hold the racket, all that. But that's one of the big reasons why tennis players don't have as many shoulder and elbow problems as baseball pitchers, because baseball pitchers have a lighter implement, and they release it. They release the ball, whereas tennis players have to hold on to the racket.
Thank you.
No problem.
Mark, do you hear me, Mark?
Yes, I hear you well. How are you?
I am super fine, thank you.
Wonderful, good to see you.
Say hello from Switzerland.
Yeah.
We were working at the time where COVID was, and our daughter Joanne was around 500, between 500 and 600 on VTA.
Yep.
Actually, she is 160, and
Congrats, that's awesome to hear. That's great news.
Thank you so much. And we were following your program with her serve, which I would say she had a poor serve at the beginning, and now she is, I would say, in the middle of the range of the girls, around 100 and 200. So
that's awesome to hear. Yeah, I'd love to see if some point if you can send a before and after, sort of how you worked on it, like where it started a couple of years ago, where it is today. It's just great for me to see sort of the progress and how you made some of those adjustments.
With pleasure. I have that everything on my iPad. I will do that with pleasure. Awesome. And so where we started and where we are now. My question to you, actually I have two questions. So my first question to you, we were working a lot on loading. So here in Europa or in Switzerland, so we learn, not the back foot loading to be too early on the front foot, as I learned that, and so, and I teach that as well before, and that was a big change for her and in our academy. So we changed a lot there, and we have a really lot of progress and on the serve. For me, the specific problem with Joanne is when we were working on the loading. Actually, when she serves, I think what we were always looking for, because she opened too early, so we want to have her to stay side on. But actually this synchronization, to synchronization between when she's coming up with the shoulder and when she has to go to get the hips involved, that makes it quite difficult. Yep. Do you have there a timing recommendation which you can give me on what I have to look when this hip have to open?
So yeah. So great point. Like, so you've got the back leg loaded pretty well, but when they come out of the load, when they start coming off the ground, they're starting to open their hip. Their right hip is rotating too early, which causes their shoulders to rotate too early. So
Yeah.
your question is related to how do we time that better, or what cue should we use to stay side on longer?
Actually, it's the inverse. So actually now I think she is a little bit too long side on.
Got it. So
Okay,
she's really over focused on staying side on, and she's
and
not releasing at the point to give her that power right at the end.
yeah, exactly. So
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. So
it's looking
really
good.
Go
It's
ahead.
looking good. You know, when I look at it, it's looking good. But there is a lack of power,
Yeah.
which you would have with the other one more. But actually, it's not the way I want to how it should look. So I don't tell it to her, but for me, it's a little bit challenging.
Yeah, no, you bring up a really good point. We see this sometimes when we over focus on staying side on too long. So they stay shoulder over shoulder all the way through contact, which is actually not where we want to be. We know we use that cue sometimes to help them recognize that they do have to be side on pretty close to contact. But at contact, you want to be about a 45-degree angle for a right-hander to that net post. So at contact, they have opened up just slightly. Before contact, they should be side on, but at contact, you want that really kind of quick release where the body does open up slightly. So the hard part for you is how are you going to coach that? Because verbally, it's difficult for the athlete to feel because that's happening so quickly. So what I usually do is I say our goal is to stay side on as long as possible. But when we're getting to contact, feel like the hip and shoulder is starting to rotate at contact. Don't say before contact, because more than likely they're going to do it too early. But say at contact, you want to feel like you're coming out of that load or out of that side on position. Because you're right, if they overdo it and they really get good at staying side on, then they're not releasing the body, which is the goal. Remember, we're storing energy back and down so we can come out, up and around. The around part she hasn't done yet.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's good though. You've got her in a position you want, because that's an easier fix than the other way. That's a much easier fix, is to release a little bit earlier than to try to not release earlier. That's always the hardest fix for most people.
Okay, thank you.
The other thing you may want to do is, where's her elbow when she's making contact? Is it in her belly button?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you may want to have her release that elbow a little bit sooner so it comes more on the side of her body rather than into her belly button. So that'll cause the shoulder to rotate a little bit sooner.
Good.
Yeah. So again, a lot of that is, which is good. She's at a level that this stuff really matters. She's playing at a really high level. So the details now become really precise, and this becomes a lot of video work, making sure that you've got her in that range that is ideal for her. So that's definitely a good option.
Super cool. Thank you so much.
No
That
problem.
will help me a lot. May I ask you right away a second question?
Yeah, sure.
It's a question much more for the younger players. So what we have when we ask to throw balls or whatever, they have a warm up, they are throwing a few balls. What we often many times see is when they are here, they have the hand in this position.
Yep.
Do you see that? And so I can take a look at the ball, and then from here, they throw the ball. So this is one thing, and it's also how it is taught mostly. So they have the hand in this position. What I did with my kids is to, excuse me that, is Sam to have this hand in this position, is to have the hand in this position.
Correct.
To have this supination, and after to feel this pronation. What is your experience about throwing balls, which I see many times like this, especially by juniors, especially by girls? And actually, when we were asking like this, the first 5 minutes, it's going all around. But after, it looks really, really good. We have this supination, and after that, we have this pronation. What is your experience about that?
Yeah, the way you're teaching it is the way I teach it, same way. We have that position there, the claw or that position, rather than open like that. Because in baseball in the US, that's how they teach as well. Same thing. You have the hand down like this more, so you can be in that, and you can do it more excessively even, and then you get into supination very easily. So everything you're doing is the way I would do it. Exactly the
Okay.
same, because it's already there and it gets them in that position. And also once you put the racket in their hand, they're more comfortable in that position, because that's the biggest problem with the juniors is they're not comfortable in that position.
Okay.
And then also, I also like doing, while we're doing the throwing drills, a couple of supination type exercises to get them to realize how much range they actually have here. Like, you know, you got supination here, pronation here. So if we can get them to feel really comfortable doing that a lot, then it's like, hey, we can really start getting that position feeling really, really comfortable. So part of it is training so that when they put the racket in their hand, that motion feels natural. Because the reason most of the juniors don't do it, it's not a natural motion for anyone to do this. That's not normal. I mean, now, you know, we don't normally do that, like in everyday activities, but we want them to be in that position when they're serving. So we have to get them to feel more comfortable in those positions.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank
no
you for
problem.
that
Great
advice,
question.
Mark. Thank you.
Hey, Mark, I've got a quick question for you.
Yeah.
One of the coaches at my club has started teaching the serve where like the elbow is out here instead of in line with the shoulder. And he's having the players start like purposefully here. Is there any benefit to that, or
At what age are we talking about here? Is this like beginner?
not beginner, like middle high school age and even adults?
What's the theory? Like, explain the theory of what they're trying to accomplish. Do you know?
Well, I've asked him that, and he tried to explain it, and none of it made sense to me. And there's been one or two of the athletes that have had shoulder issues after doing that for a while.
Because if it's a drill to try to get better supination, I can maybe understand what, because out here forces you into supination more.
Right.
If you're trying to work on that, but that I wouldn't have them serve like that, like for a match. Maybe if for five serves to get that feeling, but then you have to get into the right position at some point.
Right. I
So
mean,
if you're
like,
starting in this position and you never get into into that elbow shoulder alignment that you want, then it becomes a shoulder, really pretty significant shoulder motion. And that's why you're likely to see some issues, because it's all arm then, and you're not
yeah,
using the
so
lower body
he's
very
having
well.
them do this for like 40, 50 serves, and then as they're serving in a match, they're immediately going to here, and like they're not
No, and
accelerating.
then I mean the only way to make contact if you're in that position is to open up. And then you go
Right.
into Statue of Liberty and you've got all these other issues that it's going to cause. So without seeing it and understanding the why, my first impression is doesn't seem like it's a good idea,
Right.
unless there's a training component to it. But if they're doing 40 or 50 serves, that's way too many anyway for any type of training. If you did it like 3 to 5 serves and then you went back to your normal motion to try to work on maybe better supination and better stage 4 position, I could maybe see the argument for it. But if you're
Okay.
actually trying to get them to serve like that, I don't, it's not, I know it's not going to be helpful for the shoulder, and you're going to lose power, and you're going to open up too early. So
Right.
there's no, doesn't sound like a lot of benefit with a lot of risk to it.
Right. Is there any like how would you bring that up to this coach to try to educate them a little bit more?
It's great. I mean, one, maybe have them go through the program. That may be a way that you don't have to bring it up directly and be like, hey, what are you doing? You know, that
Right.
type of thing. That's never easy to have those discussions. But also understand the why and just be like, hey, can you explain the positioning you're trying to work on? No good server does this. So
Right.
why are you emphasizing it? Is there something that I'm not following? Just that's usually how I approach it. When you sort of know the answer ahead of time, you know that it doesn't look right, you know that it doesn't fit fundamentals, but you also want to learn. You want to learn, okay, why are you emphasizing this? Have you had success with this, or what's the background of to why you think this is a good idea when it doesn't seem to make a lot of biomechanical sense?
Right.
And it's always hard to have those discussions, especially with people that may not know why they're doing it. But again, it's probably good to have have them go through this program if they can, because it's a way for you then to get on the same page and
Right.
be like, hey, did you see this? How does your drill or way of teaching fit within this? And if they disagree, then you can have a good discussion as to why. The big problem is if they don't know the why and they can't explain the why, then it's probably not a good idea to do it. I always
Right.
say that. I say there's not one way to do anything. There's multiple ways you can get a result, but you better know why you're going through the steps that you're going with what goal you're trying to accomplish at the end of it. Otherwise, it's random and it's luck that occasionally something works, but more often than not, it won't work. And it, like you said, it could potentially cause shoulder problems, which makes sense based on them overusing the shoulder in a less than ideal position. And you just don't want to put your players through that. I mean, that's the big challenge with serving is if you do it wrong and you hit too many serves the wrong way, bad stuff happens. We know that elbows, shoulders, lower back, all that type of stuff is a result of bad technique and a lot of volume. So volume on its own with good technique, you don't usually see issues. The best servers of all time typically don't have a lot of shoulder problems. Like you look at the best servers throughout history, not one of them has had a shoulder problem. Sampras, Isner, Ivanisevic, Serena, you've got a list of them that you would think, okay, with as many Federer, with as many serves that they've hit in their life, they've hit more serves than anyone else on the planet, yet they've had less shoulder problems because of their mechanics are so fundamentally sound. Then you have others that have had success at the pro level, like a Pat Rafter, for example. He had a pretty effective serve, but it technically, fundamentally wasn't very good because he had huge hyperangulation, elbow behind the line of the shoulder, so he had a lot of shoulder problems, multiple surgeries, issues. Tommy Haas, same thing. They were good players, obviously, great players, but their serve mechanics weren't optimized and they made it work for themselves, in their careers, but they had a lot of problems as a result. Venus Williams compared to Serena. Venus obviously had success serving, but she had some limitations and she had a lot more shoulder problems than Serena did because the mechanics were very different.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. We had a question come in the chat. Any thoughts on why Jensen Brooksby hasn't made more drastic changes to his serve? Great question. I've spent a little time with Jensen over the years, so I know him a little bit. There's a lot of factors that go into why players don't make changes. Partly it's a coach. It's the coach that they're working with has a certain way of teaching, coaching, things like that. So you have to sort of understand the dynamics sometimes. Players usually don't make changes unless a coach asks them to make a change. Very rare that as a player make a change on their own. Usually it's coaches that are making the changes for the players. So that's usually a big part of it. But it's a great question. I mean, obviously, I think everyone knows that if Jensen's serve, improves, his level as a player puts him probably in a top 10, top 15 level. If he doesn't, it's going to be hard for him to get inside 30 consistently, probably, because he's always fighting every match to hold his serve. He's a great returner. His, tennis IQ is as high as anyone on the planet. He can hit shots that puts the opponents in very uncomfortable positions because they're not used to his ball flight. He has a very flat, low ball flight, whereas most other players hit with a lot more spin. So it makes it challenging, obviously, and he's a great returner. But like you mentioned, he's got a bit of a liability right now on his serve. And it's not that he can't hit, physically. It's, he's 6'3", 6'4". So he's got the ability potentially to improve his serve. And the guy's a competitor, and my guess is he's going to figure this out at some point, but he's probably going to have to make the adjustments, and be okay with making that. So it's a great question. You see it with a lot of players where that something's holding him back, and at some point they commit to making the adjustments. But there's potentially some physical things that he can get better at as well, obviously, range of motion stuff and things like that. But a lot of the time it's coaching and the folks around them, because it's rare to see a player make the change on their own without having guidance, especially younger players. When they're mid-20s, late 20s, and they've been around a lot, they've got a little bit more experience from themselves. They've been around the tour longer. They've seen other players. They maybe start tinkering themselves. Whereas when they're younger, usually that's reliant on the coach to make some of those adjustments. Question here is, how do we unteach a player to snap, or how do we correct a player that overpronates? Okay, the player is hitting with side spin when they're trying to hit a flat serve. Okay, so if they're hitting with side spin, so like a slice serve, when you're trying to get him to hit a flat serve, normally they're actually, and again, this may not be in your case, but normally when we see someone that over slices and can't flatten it out, it's usually because they're not pronating enough. Normally they're not getting into this position well enough, so they're not coming through and being able to hit down on the ball more. So if you're trying to get them away from side spin, usually the easiest way to do that is I bring him up to the service line and have him try to bounce serves into the service box on the other side of the net and have it try to bounce over the fence. I mean, if they're young, they're not going to be able to bounce it over the fence, but this concept is the same. You're trying to get them to hit down on the ball and finish with a slightly higher elbow. So if they can finish with their elbow above their wrist as they go through the motion, that helps them get that sort of positioning. Because if they're slicing it too much, normally they're coming around the ball. So at contact, they come around slightly, but then they never get into this position. So I think you mentioned that, how do we correct a player that overpronates? My guess is that they're not overpronating. They're actually underpronating. If they're only able to hit a slice, they're not able to hit it flat. So again, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm misreading your question, but that would be my suggestion, is get them up close to the net and have them do a lot of bouncers where they have to actually flatten it out. Also have them work on hitting, if they're right-hander, have them work on hitting the wide serve on the ad side a lot, because if they can hit a good wide serve, that means they can flatten it out. If they can't hit a good wide serve on the ad side, that means they can't flatten it out very well. So say John Isner, for example, his wide serve on the ad is his best serve. And he hits that serve unbelievably well. Obviously, he's tall, so it's not saying you're going to hit it the same way, but that tells you that a player has the ability and the right technique to then be able to flatten it out if they want to go flat on the deuce side. So really, really good question. Okay, the yips. Mitch is asking about the yips. So the yips is a hard thing to describe for the folks that may not know that term where you're from. Basically, it's sort of it came from golf originally, when you missed like 3-foot putts a lot. So it wasn't necessarily that you had bad technique. It was just you psychologically got nervous and you made mistakes in your technique under pressure. So technically you were okay most of the time, but something would break down in a pressure situation. So Sabalenka is a great example of someone that literally had the yips on her serve for a couple of years. She would serve matches great, and then she would get into big moments and she'd serve 15 double faults. So she worked through it the way most people should. She adjusted her biomechanics. She hits up on the ball. She uses her back leg a lot more now, and she hits a lot more spin on her second serve instead of having it so flat because she's not opening up as much. So she made those for her, pretty simple adjustments, and she's a great competitor and a hard worker. So you've seen how much better her serve has become, and hers was technical. So she adjusted her problems based on clear technical issues that needed to be fixed. And she did that, which is what great players do. A lot of players, if it's not technical, meaning that when they're serving well, their technique is great. When they're not serving well, their technique breaks down. And we see that a lot with players, even at the highest levels. They get a little flatter under pressure. There's not as much shape. So typically what I do is I make sure they're still swinging faster, not slower. Most of the time when people get nervous, they slow down their swing. When you slow down your swing, you lose spin, which means the ball's going to fly. When the ball goes long once or twice and they double fault, what do they end up doing? They slow it down even more because they don't want the ball to travel as far. And then sometimes they hit it so soft that it goes in the net. So it's this cascade of events where they get in their own head of how do I fix it? And it all started usually because they slowed down their swing. So keep the swing up, but making sure that they have plenty of spin. And then the other thing from a strategic standpoint that works really well is take away missing left or right. Meaning that if they're serving into the service box, just say they're not allowed to miss left or right. Then you've taken away 50% of your error location. So if they miss long, if they miss in the net, you can live with that. If they're missing left or right, that's 50% of a location that there's zero reason to do it. That's for the people that are sort of in the middle of the yips. They've played a few matches and they're in their own head. So you're trying to make their target zone a little bit easier. So those are 2 or 3 things that work pretty well. Obviously, going through routines and visualization and some of the strategies like that over time works really well, but that usually takes time. So you have to sort of work on short-term fixes, what can help them tomorrow, and then develop a effective routine for the long term. And that's really valuable.
Yeah, Mark, the player I'm working with is a recreational 4.0 lady, not technically sound, really at all, but she's got to play matches in season. So I've been trying to throw a lot at her. Essentially, some of the things that you've suggested I've done. I've also kind of tried to throw into a lot of variation so she doesn't get too stuck into a routine. Making her serve to different locations, making her serve from different locations all over the court to really just try to create as global a perspective as possible in terms of her feel for the serve.
Okay, so yeah, you've got a different player then. So if you're dealing with more of a recreational player and they're not technically going to make the adjustments necessarily, then I usually suggest teach them 2 serves, that slice kind of serve that they can hit under pressure and they feel pretty good with it, slice in the middle of the box and give themselves plenty of margin. And then can they hit not a kick serve, but more of a topspin serve where they hit up on it a little bit? And if they can sort of execute those 2 serves in the middle of the box, that at least hopefully gets the point started, gets them in an environment where they feel confident in those 2 serves. It's similar to pitching in baseball. Good pitchers can throw 4 to 5 different pitches, but they always have 1 or 2 that is their go-to. It's their one when they're not feeling great that day, they have confidence in. It's how do you create 2 serves that your player can feel confident in, and at the level you're talking about, if they can make the serves middle of the box, under pressure, that's a huge advantage, obviously, if they are missing a lot. So that's my sort of approach to those situations is okay, we're not going to have you hitting great slice serves wide and try to hit close to the line. We're going to hit in the middle third of the box. We're going to teach you a really competent, useful, reliable slice serve that you can slice into that spot most of the time. And we're going to teach you a bit of a topspin serve that gives you a little bit of air over the net as well. So if we are missing a few of those slices in the net, you've got a go-to second serve that you can try to take the net out of the equation. So that would be my initial suggestions if you're working with sort of that level of player that you're not going to change their technique significantly.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, how would you increase serve power for late 60 to early 70-year-olds? Would you still emphasize legs first? And would you work on more upper body? Great question. So with that age group, the big question is, do they jump or not jump? Because if they've stopped jumping at that stage, and many of them have, they'll still load, but they'll keep the front foot on the ground, which is fine. That's not a problem at all. You're still going to use your legs. You're just going to come through it without as much force off the ground. You're still going to have ground reaction forces loading into the ground. But if they're not using their legs as much, you still want to emphasize training the legs. You know, get them in the gym at least 2 to 3 days a week doing leg training, because at that age, it actually becomes more important than less important, because it also helps them move around the court and stay, you know, with enough leg strength to load into the ground strokes. But in general, overemphasize leg training at that older age because it provides better benefits. For every hour they do leg workouts, we see it across not just sports but health. The benefits for the older adults are actually higher. And try to get them to do some plyometric training. There's a lot of good research now showing that power training or explosive training in the older adults provides so many benefits from a nervous system standpoint. Obviously, you have to be careful with injury risk. So when we say plyometrics in this age group, they're not doing box jumps and things like that, but they are doing jumps, jump in place, single leg jumps, two-legged jumps, jumping laterally, jumping forward, those type of things, med ball throws, whatever they can handle within their restrictions, because they're going to have some physical restrictions, but you want them to do things with intent. So the intent is to move something quickly, move their body weight quickly, move their arms quickly. But you also then do have to spend quite a bit of time on upper body. So you've got to work on strengthening the shoulder. So with all the band exercises and things like that, you've got to work on power production. So a lot of shot put type exercises is really good for that. It's good for everyone, but especially at that age when we know they're going to start relying on their arm a little bit more to serve because their legs aren't contributing as much. So definitely spend the time on both. It actually requires more off-court physical training the older they get, because they've hit so many tennis balls, most of them in their life, that their tennis isn't going to get much better. I mean, they've put in, you know, decades usually of tennis training. So their technique is pretty refined. You know, they know their game style. They know what they're trying to do. They know their strengths and weaknesses. How do we just get their strengths better? And how do we limit their weaknesses? And that happens a lot with their strength training, their power training, things like that. It's a great question.
Mark,
yes.
The people I'm training, actually, a lot of them started tennis in their 50s, 60s.
Right. So they're still trying to improve, yeah. They're still looking at some technical work and different things.
Yeah, so I just wondered with those, like if it's like some of them I'm teaching the serve to, you know, they've been playing tennis a year, 2 years, and like they're just my serve's a power puff, it keeps getting put away. They play 3-4 times a week. Like, what would be the first place you would go to with someone like that, where we're still working on a lot of technique?
Yeah, so with them, if they're still pretty active and they can actually move around the court pretty well and they're physically capable, then I definitely would emphasize the back leg load, because that's going to probably be your biggest bang for your buck for someone like that, and trying to get them an extra, 5 kilometers or something on their serve, 7 kilometers faster on their serve. You could definitely do that just by teaching them how to load and unload from their back leg effectively. So I would definitely emphasize the legs in that type of player. And then making sure that their range of motion, their thoracic extension range of motion is worked on as often as they can, and their internal shoulder rotation. If you can get mobility in those two areas, that's going to help them tremendously with their arm coming through the right positions. So if you can get their legs to get a bit more powerful and they load that back leg effectively from a technique standpoint, and you get their thoracic spine to have more extension and their pronation ability improves, then you've got a lot of good things to work with. If they're real stiff in their upper body and they don't have good range, and then they're not getting anything out of their back leg, yeah, then they're basically arm serving it. And at some point, that may be all they will do. But it sounds like you're working with a lot of players that physically can do a lot more than that.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah,
Yeah, no problem.
Mark, can I ask you one more question, please?
Yeah.
Okay. What is your experience, or do you have experience with the eccentric training?
Yep.
With that training, you know, with that training wheel?
Yep. The flywheel,
So,
yeah. So I use it quite a bit for certain positions. It's great. We've been doing eccentric training for 20-something years. So there's a few devices out there now that make it a little easier. We used to do it a lot where we would do bands and we would add resistance to the eccentric component of the motion before a lot of these devices. So you would play with bands. So if you think about a bicep curl, make it easy. So on the concentric, the way up is concentric. And then on the way down, you would actually have a band that would be connected to the ceiling. And as you go down, it gets harder and harder and harder. So the further away you go from the middle, the harder it gets. So that's eccentric training. You're just loading the eccentric portion of the movement. And the eccentric load is typically where we see the injuries happen, is during an eccentric motion. So the concept there is we load you heavier during eccentric work because we know that's where most of the injuries happen. And humans, by our strength curve, are about 30 to 35% stronger eccentrically than concentrically. So we have that range that if we only use dumbbells or barbells, it's the same weight on the concentric and the eccentric. There's a little bit of gravity involved on the eccentric, which makes it even easier on certain movements. So you need to offset that by loading heavier eccentrically. And that's why the eccentric trainings become so popular. The challenge is you get a lot sorer when you do eccentric training. So, you know, people that have, you know, DOMS or delayed onset muscle soreness the next day after a workout, you get that only from the eccentric. You really don't get it from the concentric movement. You get it from the eccentric movement. So you have to be careful implementing eccentric training like that, because the first few times you do it, you're going to get a lot sorer than normal, and you have to be aware of that. So be careful with doing a lot of eccentric training because it's important, it's valuable, it makes you better, but it also increases injury risk slightly because that's where the injuries typically happen. So you're training it to offset that or to get you more adaptable so you don't get injured in matches, but you potentially could injure someone in training because you're putting them in those positions. So just be cautious on progressing. Just like anything else, if you're doing more advanced training techniques, which I would say this is a more advanced training technique, you can increase the risk of injury if you don't know what you're doing. So just progress gradually with it. But it's definitely good, valuable. There's some good, very good research behind it. We use it quite a lot.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, so if the loading phase is correct, how do you get a good kick on the second serve with respect to the toss, contact, racket head path, starting from acceleration to finish? Okay, great question. So assuming you've loaded the back leg effectively, you've got into a good stage 3, then the biggest goal of a kick serve that's different than a regular flat serve or slice serve is your body position goes a little more up than out. So when you're side on like this, on a flat or a slice, you're going to go a little bit more into the court, whereas on a kick serve, your body goes up a little bit more. You have a little bit more thoracic extension, so that your ball toss is a little bit more to say 11:30 or 12 o'clock rather than 12:30 or 1 o'clock. So there's a slight adjustment in ball toss location, which causes you to have more thoracic extension. And then the racket path obviously goes a little bit more from say 11 o'clock to 1 o'clock. And that's really the only difference. You're not changing anything significantly more than that, but those three things are pretty big adjustments. So it's body path is going up more than out. You've got more thoracic extension. Your ball toss is a little closer to 11:30, 12 than 12:30 or 1, which helps with the thoracic extension position and things like that. And then your racket path goes from closer to 11 to 1 from that perspective. So hopefully that all made some sense. You know, you don't want to sort of have significantly different technique on kick serve versus flat, especially at the higher levels, because you don't want to give away your serve completely. But most of the time, you can tell someone's kick serve from a flat serve. And that's okay because you're getting the benefit of that higher kick, higher ball over the net, things like that. Let's see. Okay, I think we're gonna have one last question, and then we're gonna have to finish up. How do you fix a high elbow and level hip position in the loading phase? So the high elbow and the level hip is connected, obviously. If your hips are level, your elbow position is gonna not be optimized. If your hips are more back, back hip is lower than the front hip, then you're typically in a better elbow position. So I would always address the hip before addressing the elbow. The reason being is you can address the elbow with level hips and you may get your elbow down, but that doesn't fix your hip problem and your load problem. So always fix the hip before you address the elbow. So the high elbow with level hips is very common. The low elbow with the level hips is very common. Both of them are the same problem. The body knows it needs to get the elbow down, and the high elbow allows more range for it to pull down from. That's why it starts high and then it potentially drops, or it starts high and it just goes straight back down the back of the body into stage 4. So you want to fix the hip and make sure that the hip moves in the right position first. So always address the hip before addressing the shoulder. Awesome. Well, hey, I want to thank everyone for your time. Yeah, this was a great session. Again, this will be recorded. I'll put it up in the modules, and so you can re-watch it. And look forward to doing one of these in about a month or so. So keep in touch. Look forward to following the progress, and let me know if I can help in any way. Take care, everyone.